As we've been discussing, and as kind of the purpose here is to really look at managing your SaaS software estate, similar to how you would have controls, policies, technology, et cetera, in place for your IT asset management program. So thinking about that, there are kind of four main areas that we're going to cover off in the subsequent slides: tooling, policies, processes, and controls. You should already be thinking about these along with your SAM and ITAM program, right? The assumption here is that you're working within the confines or within the structure already of an ITAM program. We're just going to apply those concepts to that SaaS estate. So in that aspect, we're thinking about a lot of the kind of continuity and similarities and leveraging that to really add value across this other kind of use case, shall we say. So on the right, we're talking about some of the value adds and some of the intrinsic kind of structures and frameworks and approaches that are already there, existent in an ITAM program. So in your ITAM program, you're going to be focused in thinking about tooling and integrations, APIs with multiple data sources. From that perspective, you can think about, linking to some of the SaaS portals, et cetera, to your existing ITAM repository or solution, just as quote unquote another integration. So that's kind of why we highlight that point. Ryan did talk about the holistic, trustworthy data aspect. That should be consistent throughout ITAM, right? Whether it's SaaS, whether it's cloud, whether it's on-prem, whether it's a hybrid, et cetera, you should always have that basis of being able to provide actionable intelligence to the business. And actionable means you can trust those recommendations and it's going to be a value add. So that is a hallmark of what we recommend in SaaS and otherwise. The renewals process, we'll talk a little bit more about processes in the subsequent slides. The renewals process should be a robust and mature process, again, focused not just on SaaS, but be more holistic. So the fact that, you've got an existing program, that's kind of the assumption going in here, that's something that you really want to zoom in on and kind of hang your hat on, are those mature processes that are able to support multiple use cases. So in this case, we're talking about SaaS. And then Ryan touched on the publisher prioritization as well. So that approach is very much what we advocate and what we recommend, so that you're not chasing around kind of onesie twosie publishers that you don't have a large spend or large risk with, and that you're really adding that value where it's going to make the most difference in your organization. You're really moving the needle maturity-wise. So the first two areas we're going to talk about are tooling and processes. So this is just kind of a mid-level walk through each of these topics. Again, each one of these areas in the quadrant we could have a whole webinar on. So we're just kind of hitting the major points just to kind of frame up the discussion and hopefully provide you all with a sustainable and go forward approach relative to how you can think about SaaS management. So some of the tooling considerations, we thought this would be kind of easy to present in kind of a tabular form to organize our thoughts a little bit. The first column is by way of calculation and analytics. So by that, we mean kind of what are the capabilities of the tooling or of the solution. To call out and to mention, we are very much, again, from that previous slide that Mario was walking through, tool agnostic, right? So that means what you'll have to do in your organization, we're not going to say, okay, tool 1 versus tool 2 is a lot better or a lot worse. What you're going to have to do, and what you should do, what's recommended that you do, is take a very agnostic approach yourself and let the data drive your decision. It's not, okay, well, so-and-so has purchased this solution, so we need to use it, and then you're going backwards. Start with the data, and that should inform and drive your approach, not only in SaaS, but for your full program. So in the area of calculation and analytics, and when we say tooling, we're thinking about tooling as part of a larger solution, right? So think about that as kind of a puzzle piece. The tool might be an important puzzle piece, but it's not your full solution. You might have some manual effort, you might have some additional reporting, you might have some other processes and procedures that support that tool to create the full solution for how you manage in SaaS. So in calculation and analytics, this is talking specifically about that tooling, that portion of the solution, what it can do. Can your tool analyze named user input, login information, transaction information. So those of you who are familiar with SaaS know that there are nuances in those license metrics that could determine wild fluctuations in the output in terms of being compliant or not, and what you need to manage and what you need to monitor. So are those native to the tool? Does your tool support an automated reconciliation process? So can you go into your tool and say, I want to kick off a license balance or effective license position ELP every hour, every week, every month to have my reporting? Or is that a manual process? Do you have to refresh your data sources? So kind of considering how old is your data? What is the latest and greatest information getting in, again, to support that trustworthy, holistic approach that's going to inform your actionable recommendations to the business. So how manual versus how automated is that? Again, here, and these are very much open topics, right? So there's no right answer. If your tool is a little bit more manual, that's not to say it's bad. You need to make sure this is going to fit your use case in your organization. So just some considerations here. Last but not least, on the calculation analytics side, are you able to look at different user profiles or user departments or roles? So some license metrics and some SaaS publishers depend on varying profiles or varying departments or even roles of users to determine license consumption. So is that capability in your tool or not? Again, kind of taking that data point driven approach. Are you hitting the mark with your current tooling, or is there a potential gap? And again, we keep this kind of consideration level and a bit tool agnostic just to consider some of these concepts. The next is ease of integration. So if you have specific portals where you can access or easily aggregate some of this publisher information, is a native API or connection to that out of the box possible, or is there a lot of customization involved? Can you also integrate this tool or part of your solution with your existing purchasing system to get a full ELP or compliance type view? Can you not? Is there additional customization that has to happen there? Again, kind of open-ended questions. Are there workflow integrations? So for example, if you run an ELP and you determine that you're oversubscribed, are you able to, via an existing workflow tool or service management type tool, are you able to deprovision a user? Are you able to shut off a subscription? Are you able to, if you're way underutilizing your licenses and you want to optimize, can you kick off a deprovisioning job? Is there an integration that's possible to other parts of your service management estate or not? You know, is there a lot of development involved? So that's kind of the scale on each of these. Can it happen out of the box? Can it happen at all? Is there a lot of customization? A lot of these different topics are going to kind of fall somewhere in that spectrum. Is hybrid integration and identification possible? So if you've got a publisher that has, let's say, some on-premise portion, and maybe they operate some in the cloud, maybe they're a mix of SaaS and perpetual licensing, is that reflected and easily managed within your tool? Or is that just a mess? Or do you have multiple tools? Are you going to have one view with SaaS, one view with more traditional license management, and the overlaps or any potential gaps there? So, you know, thinking about, again, a solution might be made up of multiple tools. So you've got to consider those items. For reporting, is your reporting native, right? Is there a value add component? Because ideally you want to have as much as possible done in an automated and sustainable way using any kind of tool. Is the tooling capability, the reporting capability sufficient to swivel in hand to senior management? Is that something that they're going to understand and be able to take those actions, the recommendations coming from the program? Or is that something that you need to take to a Power BI type tool to have some rich reporting? Are there integrations that's possible? So if you have thinking about multiple tools, again, as part of your solution, and your existing ITAM tool or your ITAM repository is doing some fancy reporting via Power BI, can you integrate in your SaaS data points also to Power BI? How difficult or how easy is that to consider? And is there capability within your tooling to look at some of the data sets and slice and dice them, having some additional segmentation? Could you run an effective license position for a business unit or for a cost center or for a country or for a cluster of buildings or whatever kind of organizational segmentation you would want to achieve? Or is that really difficult to do? So just some considerations again on the tooling side. It's not bad if you don't have this current capability, but more kind of food for thought. On the process side, we mentioned this before in that previous slide, walking through these kind of 4 areas. We're assuming that you have processes existent in your ITAM program. You should really look for process maturity, being able to accommodate multiple use cases. So if you have a process to request so-called regular standardized software, your managed catalog should expand to include SaaS, right? So you should have on-premise software, but also commonly used SaaS software. Your back-end request process, including provisioning, et cetera, should include standards of SaaS software, right? So you want to make sure that, for example, your software asset management or your IT asset management team has visibility, that you're able to forecast demand by speaking to the application owners of SaaS applications within your business. And potentially, if you're looking at some of this tooling in terms of reporting, in terms of usage and trending, you would think about that relationship. So very similar to how you would operate potentially in an ITAM program with your ITAM team working with the finance department, working with procurement and sourcing, and working with those application owners to be proactive with your license management. By that, I mean procurement and sourcing would own the renewals and the purchasing cycle. They would come up with a requirement to say, okay, we've got a publisher and we have a new renewal coming in February, and it's a large one. So ITAM and SAM team, we need to have visibility on all this usage. And the ITAM and SAM team would follow up with that application owner to say, okay, renewal in February, let's confirm these numbers and provide it to procurement sourcing. That way you've got a value add, finance gets a consistent view, and you renew ahead of time, and you make sure you're optimizing those renewals with your key publishers. On the process side as well, it's important from a service management perspective, not only IT asset management perspective, that you have a robust and mature joiners, movers, leavers process. A lot of the license metrics and license consumption in SaaS are driven by subscription, and that's tied to, you see that upper left-hand corner in the calculation analytics, named users or logins, right? So these are tied to actual people or accounts. So it's important that you leverage your HR information and identity access management information and work closely with those teams to make sure you have an aligned and very clean view on that data. You can also flip-flop and utilize a lot of your trustworthy data from IT asset management to ensure that they've got a clean view. It's recommended that if you have a solution here, you've got a tool that's able to integrate that management capability via directory management solutions. So single sign-on, et cetera, to ensure that you're driving that automation and you've got a view that's based in reality and a reality of very trustworthy data across kind of the HR and identity access management spectrum. The other couple areas of the quadrant we're going to cover off on this slide. So we're talking about policies and controls. Policy categories are a little bit more preventative. So when you think about, I'm going to hop around here for a second. When you think about preventative versus detective control, typically just because of the nature of how SaaS is potentially spun up in the organization, and you've got a little bit more difficulty getting a handle on the visibility initially, we talk about being a little bit more preventative in SAM, right? Because you can technically limit if people want to install software on their machine, you can lock that down with administrative rights, et cetera. Whereas the distributed and easy to access nature of SaaS makes it a little bit more reliant on detective control. So in the policy categories, typically these are viewed as preventative controls, right? You want to drive end user behavior and correct behavior to ensure that you're not creating a larger issue, right? That people are following along and doing the correct things to make sure they're not creating additional incompliance, et cetera. Number one here in SaaS is very much from a security and infrastructure review type perspective, that there should be some statements in your information security and infrastructure usage policies that say, Unauthorized SaaS instances should not be allowed, right? And policy should also always contain some information about enforcement. So, it should share with an agreed end audience. Okay, we're going to contextualize this and say what you need to do and what you need to not do. But if there is a what you need not to do, there should also be a consequence, right? And that comes with policy enforcement. We mentioned in one of the previous slides about the ITAM steering committee. Their mandate and support is critical here, because if you've got a policy that says you really should not spin up any unauthorized SaaS, and someone says, yep, I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then they get caught, if it's not being enforced and those consequences are not brought to bear, then the next person who gets wind of this, oh, so and so had an unauthorized SaaS instance and that was okay, then that's going to proliferate, right? So we want a very even-handed application all through the business, a uniform application of policy. So all of these policies should have a consequence, right? If you spin up an unauthorized SaaS instance, then you're going to have a talk with information security. If it's really bad, you might have a discussion with HR, right? There should be some consequence in here. But that's the first one that we would recommend, is that your information security policy and infrastructure policy say they should at least, those two teams, be involved in review when there is SaaS that is spun up. So this is kind of the preventative measure of control. In terms of spinning these up and funding SaaS instances, there should be something in your corporate purchasing policy to say, when you as an end user decide to spin up a SaaS instance and not follow the regular sourcing process, so that's kind of those subsequent couple policy categories we'll cover off, it should have a statement to the effect that you will not be reimbursed and that you are not allowed to purchase instances on a corporate card without express written permission as an exception. What you want to do as much as possible is drive via a centralized and centrally managed request and renewal process so that's supported by procurement and sourcing, and you've got that spend visibility. If there are instances that for whatever reason must go outside of that process, then those end users, those actors, need to be granted an exception. It is management by exception that you want to strive for. So if you have to go outside of that process, should be few and far between. And to be honest, you should have some language in your sourcing procurement policy that says, if you are found to have spent money on a SaaS instance, it's not going to be reimbursed, right? And again, some enforcement and consequences here. One of the ways, just as an aside, to get some good visibility on some of your spend, and especially if you're kind of doing this for the first time and just kind of you have a greenfield approach saying, right, we need to get a handle on this, is look through purchasing information. That's a very rich area where you can drill back and say, okay, we may not have visibility to whatever the marketing department's doing or whatever the events department or some other department is doing, and it's just internet traffic, so it's hard to tackle. But we see these weird purchases, or we see these non-approved purchases, or we see a whole bunch of purchases on a P card or procurement card that we can then go chase down. And you've got an individual to ask and say, okay, what is this spend? It looks like SaaS spend. Then you can start doing your consumption visibility and tie those ends together. But in terms of policy, very much you want to drive behavior to go via a centralized request channel as much as possible. And that's that last one. You should do as much as possible to support those central purchasing channels. So the policy language should essentially say kind of what I alluded to. You have a standard request process. If there is an exception in the area of SaaS, then you need to have an approval before you go ahead and execute those purchases. On the control side, I touched on this at first, that SAM is a little bit more preventative versus SaaS being a little bit more detective, in that if you have a determined person in marketing with a P card, right, they're going to spin up a Salesforce instance, faster than you can snap. It's hard to prevent technically a lot of those things. There are some ways, but it's a lot easier to kind of go through and say, okay, we're going to find instances of shadow SaaS where people are not following the correct processes and go after them and remediate those. One of the recommendations, though, to that end is to have a very proactive and good working relationship with a lot of these publisher account teams, right? So the Smart Sheets or Datadogs or SailPoints of the world, you can go out and say, okay, we need to have some value add type reporting. We need to have a centralized purchasing channel. So for instance, if you're working with Smartsheet and Smartsheet says, right, we can develop for you some reporting that gives you visibility to all of your spend. So maybe not even via your central channels, but a report directly from Smartsheet, from this publisher that would say, okay, so and so in marketing department who wasn't approved, or we don't know if they're approved, they tried to send us a purchase order, and they're not our key contact. So we're going to proactively reach out to you, procurement and sourcing or IT asset management team. And then that way you can proactively head off some of that spend and say, okay, marketing department, what's going on? That was a non-approved purchase, or that purchase went via a non-central channel. If you're working proactively with these publisher teams, they can also help you to gain visibility into co-term agreements. So we worked with a client who had a few SaaS tools in place. One of the comments on the call with an application owner was, wow, okay, I had no idea. We have another department who's utilizing this exact same tool with a little bit different feature set, and they had 2 different agreements. So even internally in the business, there were silos, right? So if you're working proactively with some of these account teams on the publisher side, they would be able to give you visibility and say, okay, did you know you've got 4 other agreements with us, these other 3 departments? So let's work to co-term these. Make sure they renew on the exact same date. That way, your renewals process, your optimization and risk mitigation processes are a lot easier. Be proactive. And the last one cannot be stressed enough. Don't hesitate to push for value add services. You want to have a productive long-term relationship with all of your publishers. Again, and these are kind of a little bit generic to ITAM and SAM as well as SaaS. You should be doing this across the board, but especially in SaaS, this really helps. If you say, look, we'd love to have some proactive reporting. We'd love to know when someone from marketing emails you and it wasn't authorized. Please come back to us proactively, right? So those are some value add things you can ask and don't hesitate to ask from your publishers.